Now we have basic understanding of how to create views using HTML and directives. It's time to understand how we can handle user interaction and business logic in controller. Do you remember the bad version of our addition of two numbers program? This business logic is hard to test as it's coupled with the DOM access code. We need to find some way to get these input values to our business logic without writing any DOM access code in controller. And guess what? Yes, the wish has come true now. We can create a controller to handle the business logic by creating a module and calling a controller function on it. So I have created a controller.html file. Let's open and create our first controller into it. So I have basic HTML markup in place for my addition of two numbers program. My custom module created using Angular.module function and associated with the HTML file using ng-app directive. So I'm gonna enter number values in this text inputs and click on calculate button. I want these calculations to happen in my controller as we use controllers to handle the business logic. And this addition is business logic for my application. Before creating the controller, I'm going to create one variable, say my app, and store the module object returned by Angular.module function. Next, I'm going to use this object to create the controller. So I'm going to call the controller function on my app object. Now this controller function accepts two parameters. First one is the name of the controller. So I'm going to give it a name of app controller. And second one is the constructor function to create the controller object. Okay, so we got the controller function in its place. Next step is to decide the part of the HTML to be controlled by this controller. And any guess how we are going to have controller associated with this body element? And I bet this time you will say, hey, can we connect this controller to this view using attribute? That's right. Yes, we can do that using ng controller directive. So I'm going to associate the body element with this controller using ng controller directive and passing the controller name as attribute value. So our view and controller are now married to each other. Next step is to write the business logic in controller. And I can do that by writing a function on my controller object. So I'm going to write a function, say calculate, on my controller object using this keyword. So this refers to my controller object here. Now my basic business logic is in place. How can I call this business logic, right? And we are going to call that business logic from view. So we need a way to refer this controller inside my view. And we can do that by just referring our controller here in ng controller directive as some controller name, say app. Now I want to listen for the click event on this button. And I want you to think a bit and come up with the answer. Let me give you a hint. So I want to instruct or direct this button so that when someone clicks on you, you just call the function, say calculate. You got the answer? Cool, directives, right. So we have a directive called ngClick. We can pass it a value, which will be a function written in controller. So I'm going to refer my controller as app. And I'm going to call a function calculate on this. And this function is going to execute on the controller for this button. So who is the controller for this button? Yes, our app controller. That's what we are referring here. So I'm going to log some value inside this calculate function and run the application. I'm going to open the console window. Click on the calculate button. Awesome. So we have successfully called the function from our view. And just look at this controller function. Am I accessing the DOM from any element? No. Am I adding any event listener code on elements here? No, not at all. Because all of the DOM access code and the click listeners code has been abstracted away in this ng-click directive. So are you started getting the power of AngularJS? Yes, I can see the smile on your face. So as a happy developer, now we want to have this text input value in controller. So how can we get that? Directives, right? So I'm going to use a directive called ngModel. Model means data. And we know these two numbers are data for my application. And when the user will enter something into this text inputs, I'm going to write this text inputs value into the controller. So I'm going to write ngModel on this first text input, and its value is going to return on controller into a variable, say firstNum. Similarly, the value for the second text input is going to return on controller into a variable, say secondNum. And the best part is, Angular is going to create these variables on controller for us. So on click of my calculate button, I'll call this calculate function, this time with my model values as arguments. So when user will enter something into these text inputs, magically it's going to store into these variables created on controller. And I can collect these values here inside my controller calculate function. Now I'm going to add these arguments and store the result into one more variable created on controller, say result. As these values are string, I have to use parse into function to use them as numbers. Guess what? Now I want to pass this result into my view. And we have access to this controller in our view. So I can access all the properties and methods created on controller. But now how I'm going to show the result back to the view? So I'm going to use a directive called ngbind to populate this result value on this paragraph using our controller as syntax and referring to the result property created in controller function. So you can see we can create properties on controller using view, I mean the HTML, and even inside controller. Now I'm going to refresh the app, enter some values, click on calculate button and see, awesome, addition of two numbers is working fine. So what we have achieved. Now look at this code in controller and just think, can you take this function and test it independently? Yes, you can. Look at it. It's so clean with these arguments. And my presentation, isn't it so expressive? Made up of HTML elements and directives, right? One important thing, one secret that I haven't told here is called the $scope, which is actually responsible for storing all of our model values. And I'm going to restate my statement with controller storing these values to scope storing these values later. But as the $scope cannot be seen here, there is no point of having discussion here. So I can say data is getting stored in controller, and we're going to discuss more about $scope in coming lectures.